Throughout the ages, spiritual seekers have pursued the most elusive of human experiences, maintaining consciousness while the body sleeps. This extraordinary state represents a threshold between the waking world and the realm of dreams, a liminal space where the boundaries of individual consciousness seem to dissolve. Among the many teachers who have explored and documented this profound practice, Paramahansa Yogananda stands as a beacon of clarity, having systematized and transmitted ancient techniques for achieving what he called soul consciousness during sleep. His approach represents not merely a technique but an entire philosophy of consciousness that transforms our understanding of what it means to be awake. Before we begin, if you enjoy this video, give me a like, comment below about your thought and hit subscribe button so you don't miss any video inspired by Yogananda's teaching. Thank you very much. Yogananda, the pioneering Indian yogi who brought the science of Kriya Yoga to the West, understood something fundamental about human experience that most modern people overlook. We spend approximately 1/3 of our lives sleeping, yet we treat this vast expanse of time as a void, a period of non-existence where consciousness simply switches off. To Yogananda, this represented a tremendous waste of human potential and a misunderstanding of consciousness itself. He taught that consciousness is not dependent on the waking state, that it is possible to maintain awareness while the body rests and the usual mechanisms of ordinary thought fall silent. The technique Yogananda transmitted for this purpose emerges from ancient yoga traditions, but he approached it with remarkable precision and psychological insight. Rather than presenting it as a mystical marvel beyond the reach of ordinary people, he offered it as a natural human capacity that could be developed through proper practice and understanding. This democratization of the practice, his willingness to teach it to Western students who had no background in Eastern mysticism, represented a significant gift to human spiritual development. The foundation of Yogananda's approach rests on understanding what happens during sleep. Most people assume that sleep involves the wholesale shutdown of consciousness, that we simply cease to exist between bedtime and morning. This conception, while seemingly obvious, actually represents a fundamental misunderstanding of consciousness and its relationship to the body and mind. Yogananda taught that consciousness never actually ceases. Rather, what happens during sleep is that the conscious mind withdraws its focus from sensory perception and external awareness. The individual consciousness remains active, but it becomes focused on subtle inner planes of existence, what he described as the dream worlds and astral realms that exist beyond the physical senses. According to Yogananda's teachings, every human being already exists and functions in these inner worlds during sleep. Everyone dreams, which means everyone's consciousness is already operating on these subtler planes. The difference between most people and the advanced practitioner lies not in whether consciousness operates during sleep, but in whether the individual maintains awareness of what is occurring. For most people, the transitions between waking and sleeping, and between sleeping and dreaming, happen in a state of unconsciousness. The awareness simply blacks out, leaving no continuity between the sleeping experiences and waking memory. Yogananda's technique for maintaining awareness during sleep involves several interconnected principles and practices that work together to create the conditions for this heightened consciousness. The first principle involves understanding the nature of sleep cycles and the specific moments when consciousness is most susceptible to development. He taught that the transition between waking and sleeping represents the most crucial time for this work. At the moment when the body is releasing into sleep, when the conscious mind is beginning to withdraw, there exists a fleeting opportunity to observe this transition consciously. Most people miss this opportunity because they are identified exclusively with the body and its sensations, And when the body releases tension, they lose their bearings and consciousness simply follows the body into sleep. The practice begins with preparation during waking hours. Yogananda emphasized the importance of developing self-awareness and mindfulness throughout the day. He taught that the quality of consciousness we maintain during waking hours directly influences the quality of consciousness available during sleep. Someone who goes through the day in a state of dullness and mechanical reactions will find it nearly impossible to maintain awareness during sleep. Conversely, someone who cultivates alertness, presence, and inner sensitivity during waking hours creates the neural and spiritual conditions for consciousness to remain active during sleep. This preparation involves what might be called consciousness practice. Rather than waiting until bedtime to attempt the technique, Yogananda taught his students to develop certain qualities of mind throughout the day. These include the ability to observe one's thoughts without being identified with them, the capacity to maintain inner silence while engaged in activities, and the development of what he called spiritual will, the capacity to direct consciousness intentionally rather than allowing it to be swept along by habit and circumstance. As one approaches sleep, Yogananda's method involves a specific approach to the transition itself. Rather than surrendering consciousness to sleep as most people do, the practitioner learns to maintain a quality of witnessing awareness. The technique involves lying in a comfortable position and then deliberately observing the relaxation of the body. Instead of using willpower to force oneself to stay awake, the practice involves a paradoxical quality of relaxation with awareness. The body is allowed to become increasingly still and peaceful, while a portion of consciousness remains as a witnessing presence, observing the entire process. One crucial element of Yogananda's teaching involved the proper relationship to breath during this transition. He emphasized that breath is intimately connected with consciousness and that by maintaining awareness of breath, one can maintain the thread of consciousness even as the body enters sleep. As the body relaxes, the breath naturally becomes more subtle and refined. The practitioner learns to follow this subtle breath with attention, maintaining inner focus on the flow of vital energy through the body. This practice of breath awareness serves as an anchor, preventing consciousness from being lost in the transition to sleep. Another essential element involves what Yogananda called inner awakeness. Even as the external senses withdraw and the body becomes still, there remains a subtle form of perception that operates on inner planes. The technique involves learning to shift one's identity from the 5 sensory modes that dominate waking consciousness to these subtle inner perceptions. He taught that humans actually possess many more than 5 senses, but most people have trained themselves to be aware only of the 5 physical senses. The inner planes are perceived through subtle senses, but these capacities lie dormant in most people because attention is never directed toward them. Yogananda emphasized the importance of intention and sincere desire in this practice. Simply understanding the technique intellectually would not produce results. The student must develop genuine aspiration to experience consciousness in this way. This aspiration serves as a kind of beacon that directs consciousness toward the goal. He taught that consciousness itself is responsive to sincere intention, that it naturally flows toward whatever the individual genuinely desires and is willing to work toward. The mechanical practice of a technique without this underlying intention produces only mechanical results. The practice also involves learning to maintain a precise balance between different qualities of consciousness. Too much tension and effort will prevent sleep, creating a state of frustration in which the body remains tense and the mind agitated. Too little attention and one will simply fall asleep unconsciously as usual. The sweet spot lies in a state of relaxed alertness, what might be described as interested non-attachment to whether or not sleep comes. The practitioner is genuinely interested in maintaining awareness and genuinely relaxed about whether this actually happens in any given night. Yogananda taught that consistency in practice matters tremendously. This is not a technique that works through occasional effort. Rather, it requires sustained practice over weeks and months. The consciousness needs time to reorganize its patterns, to develop new pathways of awareness that can persist beyond the usual transition into sleep. He compared it to training a muscle. Just as physical strength develops through consistent repetition, the capacity to maintain consciousness during sleep develops through consistent practice. One of Yogananda's particularly valuable insights involved what happens after one succeeds in maintaining awareness during sleep. Most people imagine that this state would involve engaging in dreaming consciously, perhaps experiencing wild adventures or receiving mystical visions. While these experiences can occur, Yogananda taught that the deepest experiences often involve something quite different. As consciousness learns to remain stable during sleep, it begins to perceive more subtle levels of existence. Eventually, one may experience states of pure consciousness, dimensions of existence that are not made up of images, stories, or sensory content at all, but consist of consciousness itself in an undiluted form. He described these states as profoundly peaceful and restorative in a way that physical sleep can never be. Physical sleep temporarily rests the body and the ordinary conscious mind, but consciousness itself remains somewhat agitated on subtle levels, still processing impressions and patterns from the previous day. When consciousness learns to remain stable and focused during sleep, it can experience genuine rest at every level. Yogananda taught that this explains why advanced practitioners often require less physical sleep than ordinary people. They obtain deeper and more complete rest through fewer hours of sleep because the rest is complete at all levels of their being. The benefits of developing this capacity extend far beyond the novelty of staying conscious during sleep. Yogananda taught that maintaining awareness through sleep develops the entire capacity for consciousness and self-awareness. This heightened awareness inevitably extends into waking life as well. Someone who practices this technique consistently finds that waking consciousness becomes clearer, more stable, and less subject to the mechanical reactivity that characterizes most human consciousness. The boundaries between waking and sleeping, between the conscious and unconscious mind, begin to dissolve. Life itself becomes more luminous, more wakeful, more genuinely alive. Furthermore, Yogananda emphasized that this practice has spiritual significance. According to his teachings, consciousness itself is the true nature of existence, the fundamental reality underlying all phenomena. Most people remain asleep not only during sleep but also during waking life, unconscious of their true nature. The practice of maintaining awareness during sleep represents a step toward genuine spiritual awakening, a practical means of developing consciousness to perceive higher dimensions of reality. As one learns to remain aware on subtler and subtler levels, the sense of being a separate individual located in a body gradually diminishes, replaced by an experience of consciousness itself as the fundamental reality. Yogananda taught that this ancient technique, far from being a mystical aberration, actually represents the natural development of human consciousness. He believed that humanity is evolving toward higher states of consciousness and that practices like this one facilitate this natural evolution. The fact that most people currently find it difficult to maintain consciousness during sleep simply reflects the current general level of human development. As more people practice and master this technique, he suggested, the entire collective consciousness of humanity would begin to shift toward greater awareness and understanding. The practice requires patience, gentleness with oneself, and a willingness to work with consciousness rather than against it. Yogananda cautioned against forcing or straining in this practice. The mind that becomes agitated and tense cannot maintain awareness. Rather, the approach involves creating conditions favorable to this natural capacity of consciousness, then allowing the process to unfold. He compared it to gardening. One cannot make plants grow by pulling on them, but one can create the proper conditions of soil, water, and sunlight, then allow growth to proceed naturally. For the sincere student, Yogananda's teaching on this ancient technique offers an invitation to a completely transformed relationship with sleep and consciousness. Rather than viewing sleep as a daily unconsciousness, a time when you cease to exist, one can come to understand sleep as an opportunity for consciousness to exist in a different mode, to perceive realities normally hidden by sensory domination. Through patient, consistent practice of this technique, consciousness gradually learns to remain awake and aware regardless of whether the body is awake or asleep. The practitioner awakens not in the future but increasingly in the present, discovering that true wakefulness is not dependent on external conditions or the state of the physical body, but emerges from consciousness itself, always available and ever present.